Can online hear me?
Yes, Stephen,
Yes,
and I'm recording.
Matthew Wingfield, can you hear me? Okay, someone can hear me. Matthew too. Hi, Matthew, how are you? Matthew is normally the guy who makes sure it runs seamlessly. He's away in Germany, so he can't be with us today, but we've had great technical support. We're all up and running, so thank you for your patience, both those who are in the room and those online. So we're very fortunate to have Professor Saleem Badat, research professor in the Humanities Institute at UKZN, who is currently at STIAS, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. Professor Badat studied at UKZN, Boston University, and has a PhD in sociology from University of York. He was also program director of the Mellon Foundation's International Higher Education and Strategic Projects between 2014 and 2018, and this seminar, Indexing Transformation, is funded by the Mellon Foundation, so are many of the postgraduate students in this department, and so we're very grateful to have Professor Badat here in his private capacity as a researcher who's done extensive work in the higher education sector. And I'm not going to go through a very long sort of CV, except to mention that Professor Badat has also been the CEO of the Council of Higher Education. He was a Vice Chancellor at Rhodes University, and he's the author of a number of books, including Black Student Politics, Higher Education and Apartheid, and Black Man, You Are on Your Own, as well as being co-author of a book on apartheid education and the public and popular struggles in South Africa. In 2012, he published The Forgotten People, Political Banishment Under Apartheid, and is currently skipping through a lot here, but he's currently finalizing a manuscript for UKZN Press on tennis, apartheid, and social justice. And I found out that he was not only a really good tennis player and played with Sakros, was part of that organization, but also has a coaching soccer football coaching license from the FA. So one learns an extraordinary amount about Professor Badat. And just finally, he's also been chairperson of Universities South Africa and the Association of African Universities Scientific Committee on Higher Education. So we're really pleased that you could come and speak to us about work that is very relevant to the current teaching context that we're all involved in. And I think what's happened technologically now is also part of this world that we find ourselves in. We're all going hybrid. Hybrid used to be a good term for cultural hybridity. Now it's technological hybridity. So some embrace it, some less so, but we'll find out the implications for education, including in places like Stellenbosch University. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here and engage with you. So I want to cover my presentation in two parts. The first part is to lead into what are going to be 13 juxtapositions and 13 propositions on teaching and learning at universities in South Africa. But I want to lay the basis for that by sharing with you some of the things that I published in 2020 that actually create the space for these propositions to emerge out of that. Okay. So let me start with an article that I published in early 2020 called Trepidation, Longing, and Belonging. Liberating the Curriculum at Universities in South Africa, that was published at the Makerere Institute of Social Research Journal. And it came out of an invited lecture at the University of Pretoria in 2017, which was part of a series called Curriculum Transformation Matters, the Decolonial Turn. And this happened in the immediate aftermath of the Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall protests. And in that paper, I addressed 4 issues. The context in which the call for decolonization of the curriculum arose in South Africa, the discourse of coloniality, the question of curriculum, and ideas for curriculum decolonization. And so I'm going to summarize that paper so that it leads into my propositions. So what I argued for was a critical reflexivity and contended that there was a historic opportunity that we had in South Africa and within universities for liberating the curriculum. And I deliberately use the word liberating. I go back into our own liberation history, and that's a term we are familiar with. And I didn't want to deliberately use the word Africanizing, indigenizing, decolonizing for obvious reasons, okay? Because there was huge debates about precisely what does that mean. So liberating becomes both a term that we are familiar with in South Africa, it's part of the national liberation struggle in this country, and it's a bit more neutral than saying decolonizing or Africanizing, which raises all kinds of questions, right? And I argued that the liberating of this curriculum from old and pernicious orthodoxies that really impeded knowledge creation in this country, that arbitrarily valued certain modes of knowledge making and devalued other modes and so on, really affected us as universities in South Africa. And in that sense, let's just be honest, all of us, including myself, were implicated in some ways. Okay, I think it's very important at a personal level to reckon with those kinds of things in order to liberate ourselves too in that process. We were all, and I'm using a neutral word again, implicated in all that. I could use other words too, right? So these orthodoxies, I argued, really impeded curriculum design, teaching and learning, and assessment at our universities. And I suggested that liberating the curriculum had to be a deliberative and participatory process that occurred simultaneously at national and institutional levels, and also had to draw on the comparative experience of curriculum transformation in other African countries in the global south. Why? Because, you know, we suffer from this exceptionalism. Somehow we are never going to fall into the traps of other countries in the global south and the rest of Africa. We're unique, right? We are South Africans, you know. We know how to do things when other people don't know how to do anything, right? And I'm saying, let's learn from other parts of the world. Ghana, Uganda, other places that have had to navigate these kinds of issues. We're not the first to have visions of decolonizing our society in our country. Of course, I also argue that liberating the curriculum had to be inextricably connected to transforming institutional culture at Stellenbosch, at Rhodes, at Wits, and places like that. And it had to also be linked to clarifying the purposes, the goals, and the roles of universities in South Africa, rather than just taking that as assumed. A society that I argued has to simultaneously pursue environmentally sustainable economic development, social equity, and the deepening and extension of democracy. And yes, I want all of it, not one of those. I want all of that. I'm not prepared to trade off democracy for so-called development. I'm not prepared to trade off economic growth for social equity. I want all of it, here and now, right? So in a society and in universities that displayed continuities with the pre-1994 colonial and apartheid orders, curriculum decolonization, I argued, sought the recognition of the humanity of the marginalized, respect for difference, except for those differences that are rooted in structural inequalities of wealth in this country, which bedevils us, right? And had to embrace diversity and had to be predicated on meaningful inclusion and participation by previously excluded classes and social groups within university. 28 years later, let's just be honest, the universities, including Stellenbosch and Rhodes, are still the tramping grounds of the rich and the middle classes. Yes, certainly there are many more black students and there's been a revolution in that. But essentially, it's still the tramping ground in terms of who graduates of the rich and the middle classes, white and black. Of course, this transformation must include, as I've argued, transformation of institutional cultures and rethinking the academic and social purposes of universities in South Africa. So, in a nutshell, if the key question in the 1980s and 1990s was about physical access to universities, right, including for people like myself who are first generation, right, and if it was about epistemological access for the historically disadvantaged and marginalized as part of democratizing access to knowledge, right? The question today I want to argue is not so much epistemological access alone, but access to which knowledge and what knowledges. The physical access is not good enough. The epistemological access is not good enough. It's a question of access to which knowledge and whose knowledge. Okay? So the other point I tried to make in this paper, and this was, I suppose, speaking to the student activists, is the background I come from myself, right? Is even if our universities have many shortcomings, they are very fragile institutions. We better believe that. This is a very fragile institution. All our institutions are very fragile. They can turn like that within a 5-year period. I've seen that. Some of us have lived and seen our universities in this country are being destroyed by certain vice chancellors. It can happen just like that. Right? So I argued the high road, if we wanted a high road in South Africa, was to address the organic crisis of higher education. No, not just a crisis, an organic crisis of higher education, through formative actions that courageously tackled the transformation, decolonization of universities, and especially of curriculum in all its dimensions and complexity, and in ways that open up a new development path for our universities. This high road required a social compact amongst key actors predicated on some very clear principles. And who are the key actors? Higher education leaders, higher education administrators, academics, students, and the rest of society. There's no shortcuts to this. We need to understand what the purposes of universities are. We are not hospitals. We're not social welfare institutions. We are universities. The low road, which Jonathan Johnson has also argued, and which I argue and debate with him all the time. Right. The low road is the gradual decline of universities in South Africa through a combination of inadequate funding, which we are suffering from in this country, populist demands dressed in revolutionary rhetoric, fanciful ideas about universities needing to be physically raised so that we can create truly new universities, inertia, and of course, let's be honest, resistance to change. That physical raising is responding to some student activists who say we must burn wits to the ground and then create something new. And I should say to them, in 25 years' time, it will still be smoldering. There'll be no new wits. Do you imagine you can create a wits or a new institution just like that? Institutions are created over hundreds of years. Better get that into your heads. A core function of the university curriculum, I argued, was to induct new generations into modes of making sense of the natural and social worlds that they inhabit and experience. The greater diversity of the new generations that inhabited our universities in South Africa meant new challenges for our universities and for new and more appropriate modes of making sense. So I'm not sure on what basis they brought you into Stellenbosch. But being at Stellenbosch and being at our university is about making sense of the natural and social worlds that we find ourselves in. Otherwise, why are we here? Certainly not to drink cappuccinos, right, and get a piece of paper after 3 or 4 years. If that's the case, then you should ask for your refund the day you graduate, because you wasted your time here. And this university has failed you, if that's all it's all about. Concomitantly, I argued that curriculum and universities were strongly enmeshed in wider institutional and social structural relations that shaped which modes of sense and meaning were hegemonic and which were marginalized. Right? Not everything is covered in the curriculum. Certain things are prioritized, other things are put on the back burner. Why? How is it possible, as I asked my niece, who is a politics lecturer at WITS, how is it possible that you have a PhD in politics and you have never read Samuel Ochungu? It's a scandal. To her credit, she's going to publish an article soon on Samuel Ochungu because she has now discovered, where was your supervisor? What kind of education have you had at KZN, UJ, and WITS that you have never read Samuel Ochungu? You don't, I mean, she was honest enough to say, I don't even know who he is. But if Samuel Ochungu had been white, he would have been in the curriculum. Everyone would know Samuel Ochungu. That's what I'm talking about. Let's talk about our own implicability in these kinds of things. Because we didn't read those things, so our students don't read those things. Who we think is important to read and who we think is not important to read. It's a very important curriculum issue. So our universities and our curriculum are vital elements of processes of social and economic reproduction, as well as of social and cultural transformation, processes that often occur simultaneously. The reproduction is happening at the same time as the transformation. We only focus on the transformation. We don't talk about the reproduction that's happening all the time. These beautiful graduates are all being slotted into an economic system out there. We will continue to reproduce in that way the inequalities that we have in our society and so on. Curriculum, for me, is the terrain, the stake, and the outcome of intellectual and social contestation, conflicts, and struggles, and is inevitably shaped by the possibilities, the constraints, the paradoxes, the contradictions, the ambiguities of our prevailing social structures and conjunctures within which our universities find themselves. We can't separate ourselves from the overall social structure, which is powerfully shaped by race, by class, by gender, by diverse histories and things like that. We don't exist in a neutral space. I noted in 2017, speaking to a certain audience, that we're entering unfamiliar territory in grappling with the theory and the practice of curriculum transformation. And I don't just want the practice of curriculum transformation, I also want the theory of curriculum transformation. Okay. With questions of how decolonization or transformation were to be conceptualized, delineated, find expression, and be implemented. You know, this word transformation just comes out of everyone's tongue so easily. And the more wine people have had, the easier it comes out of it. You know. We never sit back to think, what are we talking about really? This is an enormous task, enormous. And I'm sick and tired of people who never get beyond this word transformation, and decolonization is a new mantra. Right, we're going to decolonize. What does it mean to decolonize? Do you imagine this is a 6-month project? This is a generation project, 25, 30 years. If we don't start now, it will take us another 25, 30 years. Okay? We look for very glib and easy solutions in these countries, and we think once we've coined the phrase, like neoliberalism or transformation, we've achieved it. We fool ourselves all the time. And the question I also asked was, how were theoretical, historical, literary, artistic, and other forms of expression and experiences of indigenous people in this country, Blacks, Africans, to be institutionally embodied in universities and other areas of society? So I must confess, I'm loving running around these areas. I've got to know this, you know, because I like running in the evenings, and I pass Krotoa building all the time. And it's always setting off thoughts in me, the name Krotoa, and how it came about, and whether that building is appropriately named Krotoa, or whether another building should have been named. But I also walk past all the time and run past all the time, and I don't see any changes to any of the names of those buildings. Is it so hard? I don't know. I don't know what the balance of forces is at this university. We're 28 years into our democracy, one building. Come on, let's get real. So obviously, liberation of the curriculum, transformation of core areas of higher education would be conditioned. Here's the reality, would be conditioned by the wider social structure, predicated on race, class, gender, power, and things like that, and by conjuncture, the immediate situation under which we work and struggle and so on, by institutional cultural conditions. Stellenbosch is very different from Rhodes University, which I know well, is very different from UCT, right? And of course, by the human agency, academics and students. No one's going to do this for you. No one's going to do this for us. And if anyone does this for us, it's not worth it. Only we can do this for ourselves. Okay. So as much as curriculum decolonization expressed a longing, you see the longing in the title, and had to do with belonging, right? Because let's be honest, for many Black students and marginalized groups, this is not home. It's not comfortable. There isn't a sense of belonging. That's why there's a longing. But as much as you have those emotions, there's also trepidation on the part of many academics, many academic leaders, by even students, a real trepidation about what's going to happen now, what's going to come. So how is this trepidation to be addressed? I take the trepidation seriously. I don't wipe it away. Right? What are the prospects of the challenges that we face being overcome? What are the institutional capacities at Stellenbosch for undertaking meaningful transformation? And what are the individual capabilities? Note the distinction between the two. Institutional capacities and individual capabilities. Can people who are steeped in an old paradigm transform? Theoretically, methodologically. You know how much a struggle it is for me to deal with decolonial theory, because I was not born and didn't drink milk that said decolonial. It's part of your identity. I grew up in Marxist theory. For me, as a Marxist and a Marxist theory person, to deal with decolonial theory is difficult. It's hard. I know why I embrace Marxist theory rather than Weberian or Durkheim and so on. That was intellectual labor. You don't just grab fashions, right? It becomes part of your identity. It's part of how you see the world, actually, when you engage with theory and adhere to theory, right? So now when you want me to take on decolonial theory, it's bloody difficult. And my conversation with decolonial theory happens through what? Through Marxism. And then I can point to the limits of decolonial theory, of things that worry me about it, that I don't think it addresses sufficiently and so on, right? So this is real challenges. This is no picnic, you know, if we really want to meaningfully transform our institutions and our curriculum and so on. Okay. So I agreed with a late colleague of yours who I had great respect for, Brenda Leibowitz, who passed away of cancer. She was here at Stellenbosch for many years before she took up a chair at UJ. I agree with her and Hendricks that the journey ahead for the academy would be a long and unnerving one, but it had to be undertaken. Yeah, it's going to be unnerving. It's going to be challenging. The consequence of not doing so would be to continue to be complicit in the reproduction of social and cognitive injustices, and to condemn students to be perpetual consumers of knowledge rather than active makers of knowledge, and condemn African academics to be remaining perpetual consumers rather than creators and authors. Right? We take the theory from Europe and we say whether it works in South Africa or not, but we don't theorize from Africa. And I don't say that glibly, because theorizing from Africa is a bloody difficult thing. And you can't cut yourself off from the world either. You've got to enrich yourself from every aspect of knowledge, wherever it comes from, but critically, of course. And then you need to theorize from this place called Africa, or this place called Stellenbosch. Right. So that was that trepidation, longing, belonging paper. Right. Then in mid-2020, in an article, the Fourth Industrial Highway, superhighway, a dangerous technocratic utopia. I responded to an opinion piece of the University of Johannesburg Vice Chancellor, Professor Shaliti Marwala, on the so-called fourth industrial revolution. I indicated in the Daily Maverick article my differences with Professor Marwala's opinion on certain issues, which I'll come back to in this paper. Okay. I respect him. He was the first to contact me to say, I like your critique. Will you have a debate with me? I said, whenever you're ready. Right? That's how we should be. We should be open to being critique and engaging, because that's how knowledge develops. Right. Thereafter, in late 2020, I turned my attention to the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications for university in South Africa in an article in the journal Transformation called Reproduction, Transformation and Public Higher Education During and Beyond COVID-19. I argued that the COVID-19 pandemic had created new conjunctural conditions, immediate conditions, but that the underlying social structures of our society and higher education remained intact. It didn't suddenly change the underlying race, class, power structures of South Africa. It changed the immediate context in which we're living. Right? If anything, the pandemic laid bare for all of us to see and exacerbated inequalities, social inclusion, and injustice in all areas of our society. We're still suffering from that, the fallout from that, with heightened unemployment and things like that. Right? After 1994, I reminded ourselves, our universities were charged with promoting social justice in and through higher education, including political democratization, economic reconstruction and development, and redistributive social policies aimed at education. White paper 1997 puts it beautifully. Right? However, as I argued, the pandemic demonstrated to us that higher education remains a powerful mechanism of unequal forms of social reproduction and exclusion of students from, especially from the working class and rural areas. Okay. So I toned it down because a friend said, no, you know, that thing about universities being killing fields of dreams and aspirations is a bit too strong, you know, can't you just change that bit? So I did use those terms in an earlier article because it's true. Let me be brutal about that. Many of our universities are killing fields of the dreams, aspirations, and ambitions of our students. Only 50 students graduate out of 100 who start our university. Do you know that? Only 50 will ever graduate. The other 50 will never graduate. Not like go to UNISA, come back, do that. They will never graduate. And who do you think those 50 are, by and large? Work it out in terms of race, class, gender, and so on. Okay. And I argued that the post-pandemic, this new normal people were talking about, the new normal, you know, Anton Rupert speaks about the great reset, the new normal, right? The post-pandemic new normal in higher education, I argued, will further entrench inequalities in higher education and create new barriers to transformation in and higher education unless a coalition of organized social forces fought for radical reforms within and beyond higher education in order to lay bridgeheads for more extensive and deeper transformation in this country. The so-called promise of a better life for all that lies in the gutter. I argued that the discourse of the new normal, the great reset a la Rupert, was a euphemism for untrammeled technocratic restructuring and consolidation of capital accumulation and elite power in South Africa. Universities were likely to witness, and I'll put my neck on the line for this, let's talk in 5 years' time again. Universities were likely to witness intensified corporatization, managerialism, commercialization, and commodification of knowledge, with transformation largely reduced to glib platitudes and about skin color. I don't like concluding that. I like being aspirational. I like to create a better society. But that's my conclusion. Deeply embedded, unacceptable legacies in higher education would not dissipate post-COVID, because we are suddenly more aware of the fact that we have impoverished students who cannot access. I have a student, postdoc in Lusiki. She cannot access all these things. So I don't know what vice chancellors are talking about sometimes. I think they're living in a world of their own. They talk about this beautiful new normal that's coming, that's based on technology and so on and so on. And I mean, it infuriates you when suddenly people start to speak about how this new technology and how Zoom and all that is going to create greater equity, greater inclusion, etc. in our universities. So if we don't want that future, I argued in this article on transformation, because it's a journal committed to transformation, and has been around for a long time, right? You really have to start building, and there's no substitute for this, strong radical student organizations, strong radical staff organizations at our universities, alliances between those formations, and coalitions in the wider society. If you are serious about remaking universities in this country, it's not going to happen otherwise. And you can't depend on the Secretary General of the Communist Party, who happens to be the Minister of Higher Education and Training. You can quote me on that. Okay. An old comrade, sadly lost his way. Organized radical movements could reveal the stakes, make power visible, struggle for radical reforms, and make societies hear their messages and translate those messages into political action. Here's the challenge. You can struggle as much as you want in that area, and that area, and that area, and that area. I still don't know of how you can bring about meaningful change without a political party and a political program. So you can have NGOs till you are blue in the face, and you can have social movements in every arena of society. Unless they coalesce and come together, you're not in the game. Because at the end of the day, as much as we dislike the state that we have now, there's no substitute for the state. I'm afraid gift of the givers can't change everything. You need something called the state to effect change. An honest, non-corrupt developmental state, of course. Right. Okay. So what's happened post fees must fall? Roads must fall? Essentially, the student movement has completely abdicated. Having created a new agenda, it's abdicated that agenda to university administrators, supposedly academics, and others. Where's the student movement today? Where's the fees must fall and roads must fall dimensions today? Hardly exists. But here's my critique, and some of you may not like me for saying this. If at least students have been involved in those things. Post-1994, academics have been completely absent and have disappeared. They have failed, in my view, to contest ideologies and administer power that has eroded critical academic values and academic rule. Senate is a very powerful body at universities. I don't see those senates playing the role that they should be playing. They seem to be simply giving untrammeled power to the vice chancellors and the senior management of universities. Now we're more than implicated in that if we're academics, I'm sorry to say. Because we undertake academic self-rule through the Senate. We are the guardians of the academy. We have to hold the vice chancellor and his management team accountable. And yet we've allowed this corporatization, this commodification, this commercialization to run rampant. We've hardly said a word about it. Well, let me be fair, we have said words about it, but we've done very little about that. So let me now go on to my 13 juxtapositions and 13. Sorry to make some of you feel a bit bad, but I've been a vice chancellor I've seen this. The way senates have simply ceded authority. Even at Rhodes, I had to like scratch my head and say, can't you be a little more vigilant? Can't you contest a bit more? Right. So let's go on to the propositions. That's the context that we find ourselves in. So first proposition or juxtaposition, conjuncture, structure. Right. As good anthropology and sociology students, you know there's a difference between structure and conjuncture. They're not the same. We are in a new conjuncture, as I argued, created by COVID. And we must, of course, consider and debate the implications of that for teaching and learning. And of course, we must act. We can't just theorize, we have to act. Right? But what we should not do, as my friend Marwala does, is to claim that what has become associated with 4IR or COVID is inevitable and will sweep universities. No, there's nothing inevitable about that. We are not entirely at the mercy of big technical and sociological forces. We are humans, we have agency. There are always alternatives. We can devise ways to outwit trends that threaten the integrity of our universities if we are prepared to act. We are not these dupes. We are not a la Durkheim, just at the mercy of these big forces. We act, we can bring about change. Claims that the contemporary trajectories are inevitable and that there are no alternatives are not only not true, but when they are voiced by leaders in higher education, like vice chancellors, what else do? They stifle debate. They stifle creative engagement with the challenges that we face. They virtually outlaw certain pathways that could be available to us because the vice chancellor has spoken, right? And there are not too many people brave enough, not even in a Senate, where you should be brave and uphold academic values to challenge the vice chancellor. I'm not speaking about Stellenbosch or any university, I'm speaking generally. Right? So these new developments are being grafted onto an unequal social structure already deeply riveted by fissures of race, class, gender, geography, and so on. And they are unfolding under the hegemony of a certain kind of capitalism, a certain kind of globalization, and a certain kind of ideology that goes by the name of neoliberalism. This new conjuncture does not alter structural conditions. It remains inevitably capitalist and highly inequitable, as has been harshly demonstrated by the differential impacts of COVID. Responding to Professor Marwala's contention that with 4IR, every facet of society will change, I suggested that there was an overemphasis on discontinuities and an understatement of continuities, the things that would not change. Of course, things will change under 4IR if you think there's a 4IR on the COVID. But let's not exaggerate those changes. Let's talk about those things that are not changing too, because those should be also factored into teaching and learning. And would those changes, I asked humbly, benefit the impoverished, blacks, workers, women, refugees, the marginalized? Or would the benefits be the usual ones, the North, the rich, the middle classes, men, city dwellers? The first three industrial revolutions have not created a more equitable world. So why do you think the fourth industrial revolution is going to suddenly create a more just world? You can't put all your hopes in the fourth industrial revolution. It's a technology, there are humans who have to deal with this and work out the policies of how you can harness that if you want justice, to ensure justice. But the humans have not harnessed the first three industrial revolutions to create a better world, where everyone benefits equally. So yes, the fourth industrial revolution can enhance people's lives, some people's lives, not everyone's life. So, yes, the fourth industrial revolution has implications for curriculum. It will necessarily shape curriculum at teaching and learning, but it will shape it to the extent that you and I want it to be shaped. Not because it's going to force us to do certain things. It doesn't have that magical power. Just because it's arrived, it's going to change the whole curriculum. Humans bring about those changes. So, first proposition, as we grapple with the unfolding new conjuncture, the so-called big reset, the new normal, and its implications for teaching and learning, we must also seriously confront what will not change. Social structure, and what does that mean for teaching and learning? We should not be captivated by projected South African future akin to the rainbow nation that confuses ideals with actual realities. What are the implications of deep structural inequalities for teaching and learning? The Department of Higher Education Training under this current minister has been inadequately supporting academic development activities that give students a chance when they come to universities. It also rejected the four-year degree, which would go a long way to ensure better quality students and more graduates, right? On the most spurious grounds, by the way. And I'm sorry to say, ideas like ethic of care, humanizing pedagogy, those things are important, but on their own, they could simply become band-aid for fundamental systemic changes that are needed in universities and in society. I'm not arguing against band-aids. When you get cut, let's put a plaster there, right? Before it gets gangrenous and right. But please, it's band-aid. It's not changing something fundamentally. So that's the first proposition, structure, conjuncture. Don't mix the two and know the implications of both for teaching and learning. Second juxtaposition, discontinuities, continuities. Pay attention to what the continuities may mean for teaching and learning, and pay attention to what the discontinuities may mean for teaching and learning, right? Address both in terms of teaching and learning. Third proposition, decolonial turn, online turn. No sooner than the 1516 protests impelled the decolonial turn created by students, COVID-19, a virus, railroaded us into the online turn. Those protests, as I've written elsewhere, showed that we have inadequately engaged with the purposes, roles, and functions of universities, right? With all the talk around transformation. To know what the curriculum should contain requires a sense of what are its contents for. Curriculum is not an end in itself. Curriculum is part of something that we have projected for ourselves, that this is what universities are for, right? If we don't have an adequate sense of what a university is for, well, how can we have a sense of what a curriculum is for, or what a curriculum is intended to do, right? It means having a clear sense of purpose as universities. And it frightens me that I don't think we have a clear sense of purpose of what universities are for in South Africa, or what their roles are meant to be, and what they. Why? Because I think all universities in South Africa are pale imitations, mimics of Oxford, Cambridge, and the UK. That's why we have universities in South Africa. We don't have South African universities. That's a project still to come. We have universities in Africa. We don't have African universities. That's my book. That's why I'm at STIAS. Looking at the history of universities in South Africa from the colonial period through to the segregation period, through to the apartheid period to post-1994. My point of departure is what we have are imitations. We are still to create South African universities. Like Harvard is a US university. All that nonsense about Harvard being the world-class university. Last time I looked, Harvard is a US university. Oxford is a UK university. They are global, as is Stellenbosch for that matter, as is Rhodes, but we're not South African universities. We were implanted into this country in the early 19th century, modeled on universities in other parts of the world. As part of that implantation, there's been very little substantive, concerted, consistent, creative engagement with the legacies of intellectual colonization and racialization. And I'm quoting there someone I have great respect for, Andre Dutoit, political studies at UCT. And we have not come to grips with patriarchy, epistemic inequities, and the Eurocentrism, and the colonial epistemic monoculture that suffuses scholarship in this country. I want to just allude to one thing here. When some academics at this university can say what they said and cause that controversy recently, and they were not all white, let's be clear about that too. I'm less prone to blame them as I'm prone to blame the university and those who educated those academics. How is it possible that in 2021, a group of academics at this institution can produce an article like that, that makes the arguments that it made? Don't just blame them as individuals. Take it on the chin institutionally and work out what it means institutionally, rather than simply sacrificing those people. Because in a sense, they are victims too of a system that we have not come to grips with. But it's too easy to just blame individuals. So, as Andre Dutoit has argued, the enemy in the form of colonial and racial discourses were within the gates all the time, at UCT, at Rhodes, at Stellenbosch. And there are significant threats to scholarship in the widest sense. Okay, so let me go on to, so both COVID, both Fourth Industrial Revolution, the decolonial turn, the online turn, and so on. We need to really come to grips with those things in terms of how we're going to work with that and what its implications for teaching and learning are. An online turn has not been a disruptive influence. Let's be honest about that. We've learned how to use Zoom. We've learned how to package our materials in different ways and so on. It has not led to any fundamental restructuring of the curriculum of the kind I'm talking about, or pedagogy and things like that, right? In fact, my own experience is, from my old institution, people are tired. They've had enough of this. Look how long it took us to link up. If deans and university vice chancellors are not understanding this, that many academics want to get back to face-to-face. And while they're not opposed to this, you misunderstanding, or you're not coming to grips with the fact that you are not providing the technological and other support to those academics to really make this successful. And if this is going to be the new normal, then you better get your head around all the other changes that are going to have to happen. Because academics are spending far too much time, I know, at Rhodes, with technology and not on lecturing. Administrators are not around. So you might get a burgeoning of the IT section at the expense of academics. Watch it, it's coming. It's coming. I promise you, I've been in this area long enough to know this. People are getting burnt out. When two humanities scholars who are only 50 years old and are full professors, which you do not get a full professorship at Rhodes easily, when they want to leave academy because of this kind of thing, then we're in trouble. Because those are the best academics around, in terms of research, in terms of teaching, and so on. But they've had enough. And people are not listening. In fact, vice chancellors are saying how great this has been. Vice chancellors are saying our pass rates have improved. The quality has improved. Really? It's improved? Well, I'll tell you at which universities it's improved. Those that have KPIs for an 80% pass rate. You know what KPIs are? Yeah. KPI, key performance indicator. You shall get 80% pass rate. What do you think is happening? They're getting 80% pass rates. Why? Because their promotions are tied up with getting 80% pass rates. Otherwise, they're going to stay lecturers for the rest of their lives. You see the corrosion that's happening, right? And yet people are speaking about this is the technology that's going to deliver us more equity, better quality at a more affordable price. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. Okay. There's a lot of bad faith in this, I think, when people are not coming to grips with some of the realities that is hitting us. ICT can make really poor learning materials look very sexy and exciting. Beautiful PowerPoints that seduce us, but very little content behind it. And very little real scholarship behind it. Right? So I don't have to tell you about who has suffered under this. Not if you live in Stellenbosch, you've been fine. If you live in Lusiki and all those areas, you simply have not performed at the same level. Better quality, better pass rates. As someone was honest enough to say, in 2 years' time, we're going to get the highest subsidy we've ever had. Why? Because we had an 83% pass rate. Under COVID, an 83% pass rate. But we also know you've set multiple exams. You set one exam, not enough people pass. You set a second exam, not enough people pass. You set a third exam. And if it's happening here, it's happening elsewhere. So until a certain percentage pass, you just set exam after exam. Are we talking about these things? We're not talking. We are talking about these things in the corridors. But the minister's not talking about this because he's celebrating the online term. Okay. How am I doing for time? I'm done. Okay, so fourth, juxtaposition and proposition. The decolonial turn raised profound questions regarding Eurocentric epistemology, epistemological diversity and inclusion. And it also raised profound ontological issues. Okay, it's not just about what knowledge and whose knowledge. What are our conceptions of the people who are sitting in front of us? That's an ontological issue. So when we're dealing with curriculum issues, it's not just about epistemology, it's about ontology. What's in our head about what I imagine about you, right? Or I imagine about you. Because if I don't have a sense of who you are, how the hell am I going to teach you effectively? I learned that in 1999 or 2000 from a young, I have to put this in race and gender terms, a young African student who, after I had spoken and Martin Hall, who was the DVC at UCT, had spoken, she stood up to say, you know, I sit in that class, I'm doing business science. You have to be a pretty good student to get into business science. Right? I sit in that class and the lecturer comes and he teaches and he makes jokes from the southern suburbs. I'm the only one who's not laughing because I don't know what those jokes are, what it means, right? And you know what she says? She says, this is more profound than saying he's a sexist or he's a racist or whatever, right? That's easy. She says, he doesn't see me. How's that? How does it feel like to be invisible in a class? He is so non-racial. He doesn't see me. He has no idea where I come from. He imagines that at the dinner table in my family, we discuss interest rates fluctuations and the foreign exchange on a Friday night. And my mother is a lawyer and my father. He doesn't see me. That's what I'm talking about the ontology. Do we have a sense of who's sitting in front of us? Do we have a sense of where they come from, which geographical areas, what they bring? And not bring in terms of deficiencies, because people are too quick to say, they're all underprepared. What about what they do bring? The fact that they are survivors, that they're one of those 20 people who finish matric in this country, and they bring this incredible first generation experience. They shouldn't even be here, but they have survived and they have something to teach us. And we better factor that into our curriculum, into our readings, into how we teach and that kind of stuff. So the decolonial turn has raised these profound issues. And my fourth proposition then is there can be no social justice in higher education and in teaching and learning unless these issues are involved in a meaningful way. Does it mean more hard work? Yeah, I'm afraid it means much more hard work. The good old days of the white southern suburbs kids sitting in front of us are over. Those were boring days, let me tell you that. And quality was not very good too. We were all 50, 52, 53 reading. Right? Now it's more exciting. There's a diversity here. And we have to now struggle to make sure there's real inclusion and real participation in knowledge and not leaving people behind because we are not being aware ontologically of who is sitting in front of us. Okay. Proposition 6. The new mantra is the engaged university. Maybe you missed it. It was announced in October last year. University of South Africa, big conference, the engaged. Now you're meant to be the engaged university. I don't know what else you are. Afropolitan, but engaged too. Research at Rhodes, engaged now. So, developmental university vendor, engaged now, right? Now, if these slogans are going to have any meaning, what does it mean for teaching and learning to be an engaged university? Because there's a certain implication for teaching and learning if you're a research university, like Rhodes. We debated these issues massively. What does it mean to teach in a research university like Rhodes, as opposed to a teaching and learning university like Walter Sisulu, or Venda, or Zululand, which are not research universities? Can't be the same. Students are different. The interests of the university are different. At a research university, we should be ensuring that we cultivate our students into the mysteries of the making of knowledge, because we're a research university. At a teaching learning university where they don't do real research, they would do a different kind of thing as far as their curriculum and teaching and learning is concerned and so on. So, proposition 6, the engaged university, if it does not come to grips with what it means to be teaching and learning, is simply going to be an engagement around third stream income and a capital centric and a state centric, with genuflections here and there to ethical research, activist research, and that kind of stuff. So they'll be able to point to maybe Stephen and to say, we do activist research. Yeah, but that's 1% of research that is linked to social justice issues. The other 99% is about keeping the wheels of the economy growing and reproducing inequalities in that process, because that's what is engaged. That's my hypothesis. I bet you I'm going to be proved right rather than wrong. So we then have to ask questions about, are we entirely about private good? What's happened to the public good notion of universities? I thought we are meant to advance the public good. I thought we are meant to create better societies rather than just reproduce inequalities and injustice in our society. 7th proposition, you'll like this one. The juxtaposition between science, engineering, and technology, and the arts and humanities. A capacious notion of universities, and I'll stop here, is about creating students who are broadly educated, who are ethical, creative graduates, who are deeply appreciative of the arts and humanities, even if they are engineers. Right? My Dean of Commerce was always saying to me, it's an oxymoron, a cultivated economist. That's not me, my Dean of. It was a good deed, right? He just didn't think we could produce really good economists unless we infused into the curriculum arts, humanities courses and stuff like that, right? Yet from the president of this country down to university leaders even, it's all about science, engineering, and technology. If you want to have a good sense of that, look at the Presidential Commission on the 4th Industrial Revolution. There's one humanities, arts, humanities, social science person there out of that entire committee. And he or she is not even someone that you would recognize as an outstanding arts, humanities person, right? So STEM fields are obviously important, right? For development needs and things like that. But if you benignly tolerate or you erode the arts and humanities, you're going to erode the social value of universities in our society. What kind of society are you creating where you do not appreciate the arts and humanities? And you celebrate only technology? Because we interrogate critically ideas and conventional wisdoms. That's why people don't like us, see? Because we interrogate those things critically, right? And a humanities person says to Professor Marwala, the engineer, wait. You're getting too seduced by technology here. Is it going to create a better society? That's what we humanists do. We are spoilers. We like to mess up people's heads, right? We want them to think a bit more, right? So we interrogate notions of democracy. We interrogate notions of equality and equity and so on. What kind of society are we going to be if we can't do those kinds of things? And arts and humanities are under threat at all our universities. They're under threat in this continent, right? So we'll be a very poor society if we don't have more arts and humanities. So let me just conclude to say, at the end of the day, what I'm speaking about in terms of bringing together the fourth industrial revolution, trying to bring together COVID and universities and teaching and learning, is to say, if we're really serious about universities in this country, if we have this idea that we can play a really important role in these universities, then I think we really need to think very profoundly and deeply now about what is the purpose of our universities? What are the goals of our universities? What are the roles that we should be playing in our society? Otherwise, I'm afraid we will be reduced to simply instruments of the production of labor power for the economy. And that will be a terrible thing for our universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's an enormous amount here. I understand some people may need to leave at 2:30, but we will continue. Perhaps we'll stop at 2:30 and maybe have another 15 minutes. So we stop there for people to go, and then we'll. Oh, yes. Okay, first question, no doubt. Okay, so we can take 3 to 4 questions at a time. And is that all right? So, thanks. Okay, so let's open up immediately. Okay, and could people just briefly introduce themselves? And could somebody watch the online signs for who's put their hand up, etc.? Claire, could you?
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. My name's Claire, and I'm a new lecturer in this department in Sociology. So I liked the way you talked about liberating the curriculum as a way to rethink without being held to these ideas, murky ideas of decolonization and so forth. And so I'd like you to maybe elaborate then. You did move towards content with the curriculum, but if you could maybe elaborate on a notion of liberating the curriculum in terms of assessment. And I speak about assessment in terms of the students and how assessment of students. I recently read something where someone wrote about dreaming as methodology. And so there are these new ways of thinking about research and knowledge production. And I'd like to know what you think about that and whether these conventional modes of assessment and research ought to be maintained. And then second, related is then the assessment of staff. You hinted towards it with KPIs and so forth, but then at the next level, the assessment of universities and ranking systems. So yeah, that's what I would like to see.
Sure. Thanks. Shahid, could you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Professor Badat. My name is Dr. Shahid Tayyab. I'm also, as we chatted earlier, the lecturer in the department. I found it a fascinating talk, an interesting combination, I thought, of pragmatism coming from your clearly background in institutions and idealism. And so I'm going to push you on something.
Sure.
Because I think in the spirit of
this is going to be fun. Yeah.
I think we have to push. The first one is you know, you say, okay, we need to stop. You're speaking back against people called the students, right? So you speak against the students and you say we need them. So you say you want a social compact between key actors, administrators, academics, and students, right? On the other hand, you say that institutions are created over hundreds of years, so better get that in your head. So have you been in universities to know what kind of barriers there are, the kinds of subjects that run these institutions, their kind of history, where they come from, right? I'm talking about apartheid subjects. People formed in that time who refuse to recognize each other as human, who don't recognize, who don't even know what research is, I would say. And I'm saying that without mincing my word. Right? They don't even know. So how is this compact going to be formed? You know, what is this compact going to be? Then I want to push you on this question of you saying these universities are implanted from above, right? Now, fair enough, you're writing a book on it, so you'll wait for that. You really think that they implanted Oxford and Cambridge ideas here in a colonial state, right? People like you know, Gandhi, you know, other kinds of people, people later on, what's his name? Ambedkar, people like these were studying in Colombia in the 1930s, right? They were pushing ideas, radical ideas of change. Apartheid South Africa, these are apartheid institutions. These are institutions, right, that let someone like Archie Mappeje, right, that let the state interfere to the extent where he was not given a job, and they did not do change afterwards. Archie Mappeje is undoubtedly one of the greatest scholars to come out of South Africa. He's still being written about today as if he has no contribution to be made. So I'm very worried when we take this thing to say, oh, it's been implanted, right? There's a radical difference to say that a colonial authoritarian state produced institutions for particular purposes and academics for those purposes, right? So exactly like you say, over hundreds of years, but I'm not sure it's implanted. Are you sure it's implanted? Because Oxford and Cambridge, as Archie Mappeje, when he was in Cambridge in the 70s, met people like Taha Assad and other very radical scholars. And he came with radical ideas which shook South African academia to the point where they just kicked him off.
Okay.
And they never really changed their position, and they still don't change. One more small point, and that is about the decolonial, you know? And I want to push you on the parochialism. I totally agree with you. We need the decolonial, we need to look at it critically. But we have to look at it comparatively. There's a tendency in South Africa to reduce the decolonial term to a couple of sound bites that students tweet or protest about, right? Without actually asking them, what is this tradition? And it's going on all over the world. So in that sense, I want to push you. You know, you say you struggle to read that, right? So you rather find the limits of the decolonial because of your Marxist training. What about the limits of Marx? What about the limits of Marxist thought?
Sure.
Which has been ongoing since the 1970s, right? Which continues to go on. So my question is it something that is difficult? You know, is it something that is difficult that people don't want to engage in stuff? Or is there something else at least? And here is the question of the theory of power. One more thing about institutions, and then I'll shut up. You know, we talk about these places, right? Recently, there was a German scholar visiting here. Now, I know this guy. You know what he told me? He said the director of STIAS told him that they are struggling to get black scholars into STIAS to apply. Right? I can tell you, as a matter of fact, I know at least 10 black South African scholars that have applied. You don't even get so much as a rejection letter. And I can tell you, I personally applied for my project. I have been invited to Germany, to Holland, to America with my project. I'm not telling you that I'm a useless, I'm not trying to claim that I'm oppressed. I'm not oppressed, right? But you can't even get a rejection letter. So I want to know, how are we going to change it when STIAS, which is supposed to be the bastion of, critical thought, and these are institutional decisions, are telling German scholars, oh, we don't have black scholars, but we know for a fact that black scholars are getting rejected over and over again. So these are all interrelated, and I think this is really important, right? All the contributions. But yeah.
There's quite a lot.
Is it?
Right. So let me
just
just.
Simon as well. Okay. Do you want to just take? Look, we do have time. Those who are committed to these issues, which I think many of you are, so we do have time. Would you prefer to answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Claire, let's start with the assessment issue. So And he's right. I mean, I'll come back to the idealism and pragmatism aspect, right? Because otherwise you define yourself out of change. You must be prepared to get your hands dirty as a vice chancellor and as many other things, right? So, I think we must accept that, and while we might dress it up in all kinds of things, right? Putting 1,000 students in a sports hall and getting them all to write exams is an administrative convenience. It may not have much to do with the academic worth and value and things like that, right? And in this country, especially, and here's another implant, if you like, because it started in the 19th century in England at a particular moment in time. Because prior to that, there was no such thing as these exams. There wasn't even written exams. When you graduated, it was all about oral, right? So what I mean by administrative convenience is that, and if we can make it multiple choice, even better, because then we don't even have to mark the damn thing. The computer will do it for us. Isn't that lovely? Then we can get on with our research at the research university. You see where I'm going with this? So there are other possibilities. Like we only assess on the basis of projects or essays. Take away exams where you take it away for 1 week and you bring it back. And yeah, you don't have to be worried. Yes, students are not copying. They're sitting in the library and reading, and they're formulating the answer after 1 week. That was my experience for the first time when I left and went to York. Never wrote any exams. It was all takeaway exams. You have a week to submit your essay after that. So there are other possible ways of assessment, many other creative ways. And I think we have to sometimes ask ourselves, why don't we pursue those? Because I think there's a certain reality called 1,100 students, first years, right? Exams are easier as a way of assessing, right? And getting it done, usually what, 5 days time? You must have marked them all because the registrar is waiting for them, right? Put your head around marking 1,100 set of essays 5 or 6 times a year, right? And increasingly with the massification, when you are as rich as Oxford and you can have your tutorials, on a 1 to 5 basis, you don't have to have exams. Why? So that's what I mean by administrative convenience. They might not be the best ways of assessing knowledge and so on. Right? And we are too exam focused in this country, as you know, rather than allowing different forms of assessment and so on. So I would certainly agree with you that we can be looking at other ways of assessing. Bard College in the United States, which is a really nice liberal arts college on the river there, doesn't have take entrance exams anymore. They will, very difficult, they will take a portfolio and judge the thousands of students who want to come to Bard on that basis, not what marks you got from matric. Isn't that lovely? Because matric is not for everyone. People are destroyed in that process. Smart, talented people are destroyed in this country through the matric exam. Imagine if you had a different kind of portfolio where you could really say what I will bring to the university classroom and so on. And you'll get assessed and you get entrance on that basis. Right? So there are many things I think we can do differently. And I think we must always keep that in mind, that we are sometimes doing things for administrative reasons. Right? Recognition of prior learning. How many people have our universities taken? It's a wonderful principle and an ideal, but get your head around how you would do it practically. If you had 10,000 people applying for recognition of prior learning to come to the university, you'd have to have an army of people doing the assessment and things like that, right? And you're going to be told there's no money for that, okay? So I think we must keep alive the possibility of alternatives, right? That one day, perhaps we will do some of these things and we won't be slaves to certain ideas and money issues and so on. sorry, the second, my handwriting is terrible. The second one, something had to do with actors, right?
Mine.
Hey, yeah.
Mine. So it was assessments then on academics.
Oh, right. Assessment of academics and the, right. Absolutely, yeah. So academics want to be assessed for various reasons, including something called promotion, which is fine, right? And as long as I can only speak about the process we followed at Rhodes under me. It didn't come from the top. It went to every department. Every department had a say in what criteria they would use to promote someone, to assess someone, from lecturer to senior lecturer to associate professor to professor, on 5 different criteria: teaching and learning, research, professional service, community engagement, and leadership, right? And in order to avoid the tyranny of the natural sciences, it cannot be the same. Because I used to joke that you can do an experiment over the weekend, and then you can write 8 articles in the next 6 months. I would be very dubious about someone doing that in sociology, writing 8 articles in 6 months. I'd be happy with 2 in a year, right? So each discipline, each department has to work out for itself how you would consider your peers, right, in terms of their performance and so on, rather than just use, otherwise let the computer do it, if you want it to be entirely qualitative, right? So I think you do have to have those assessment systems, not just for students, but for academics. But I think the problem is that in some cases, and this becomes a perversion of the university, right? It's all about status. It's all about money, rather than about what is it that I contribute intellectually and academically and so on. I'm afraid I'll say it. There are too many job seekers at universities today, rather than people who have a love for knowledge, who really want to be scholars of the best kind and so on, right? And I think that does a huge disservice to our students when they are in our classrooms, in our lecture rooms and so on. And so I'll maintain and I'll always argue for that, both in terms of student access and in terms of academics. We always have to combine equity with quality and excellence, right? Both those poles must be mediated. Because if you only go for equity and you don't worry about quality, well, here it goes. If you only worry about quality and you don't worry about equity, then you simply reproduce the apartheid social structure and labor structure again. So the real challenge for universities is how do you mediate those things? Make sure constantly, and if you are wanting to have equity, make bloody sure there are development opportunities for people. You can't just bring in people and then say, now sink or swim. Good luck, 1,000 students on Monday morning. Where's that person going to make a career of their around knowledge? When are they going to do research and those kinds of things? So I work with early career scholars. It's the most fulfilling thing I do today, right? With a group of about 14 at UKZN, I've worked with 10 at Rhodes and so on. I must tell you, these are frightening people. They're far smarter than me and many of us. So that gives me hope for the future. But you know what? I think half of them won't be around in the next 5 years. Not in the university. Because the university is killing them. It is destroying them. It's burning them out entirely. Teaching, research, community engagement, 80% pass rate, blah, blah, blah. And then they get at, and be careful, because they'll soon identify you as someone who's really good, and they're going to dump you with all kinds of admin. Cluster leader, this leader, that leader. For heaven's sake, the person is 30 years old. Give her a chance, you know. As they are starting to recognize these young scholars, we're being seduced into all this admin. We're not being given the space to really do work and so on. So I think there's some real challenges too as part of that, about how you combine equity and quality. Around the rankings, Claire, Burnout University never lost a night's sleep around rankings, because I persuaded the council and the deans. We won't waste money on champagne because we don't take the ranking seriously. I think it's one of the most perverse systems that has been, and for universities to celebrate those rankings and participate in those rankings is a perversity, because we know how bad social science that is. And yet you celebrate bad social science when you are meant to be the guardians of knowledge. It's all about money. Okay, so I don't take rankings seriously. Every damn day in that daily higher education news, I'm reading about celebration. We're number 2, we're number 3. You know how many ranking systems there are in the world now? You can celebrate every day. If you're number 200 on that, you're going to be number 10 on this one, right? So I've written an article on this, you know, a present perversity and a dangerous burden for us. You do research now, not because you do it for the love of knowledge. It's because you must do it for the rankings. You have more international students, not because it's a good thing, rankings. You can play the rankings. And some of our vice chancellors have wanted to play the rankings, and I've advised them, you're doing something very dangerous. You're going to destroy your university. And in the process of rankings, you're going to destroy arts and humanities. Because for every postdoc that can produce you 6 articles a year, why do you want a humanities postdoc who's going to give you 1 article a year or 2 articles a year? 6 articles brings you 120 times 6. Humanities only bring 120,000 times 2. Look around you. The data will show you what's happening. Less and less postdocs in the arts and humanities, more and more in the sciences. Why? Not because there are smarter people there, but the money. The subsidy makes everything go around today. It's not knowledge. The quicker the Department of Higher Education Training stops the subsidy system where people get money individually in your pocket, like at some universities, the better for all of us. Okay. Look, I don't disagree with some of the things you're saying. I would approach it in different kind of ways and so on. So, like me, if you do want to be activists and want to shape things, you have to get your hands dirty. Otherwise, you must stay in a pristine somewhere where you never get your hands dirty. And you have to be pragmatic if you want to be a vice chancellor, if you want to be a dean, if you want to be an academic too. It's not just about paying the bills. It's about surviving and living to fight. Right? So, not a bad combination for the idealism and the pragmatism. Because otherwise you might become schizophrenic, right? And not useless to everyone. So how do you maintain an adherence to principles with the flexibility of tactics? Right? How do you combine both? That's what I learned in politics very early in my life. How do you adhere to values and principles and have a flexibility of tactics and so on? So I have been in universities for too long. As a national student leader, as an activist, as a rank and file academic, as director of a policy unit, as a vice chancellor, and so on. Okay. So I have no illusions of universities. No illusions at all. And as much as universities can contribute to transformation and themselves can be transformed, I have no illusions that they also reproduce society and reproduce themselves all the time. Okay. We learned that from one Louis Althusser, 1969. Every time a society reproduces, it must reproduce the conditions of its own existence. If you don't do that, what are you doing? Right? Lenin and Philosophy and other essays. Okay, on ideological state apparatuses. Right? Hard for me to have to embrace that, you know, because I would like to be able to argue that universities are really transformative. And then I have to remind myself, Saleem, look around you. So have those ideals, you know. Where do our graduates really go? How many of them are really committed to fundamental change in this country? Are not the graduates of Rhodes propping up all these places, you know? Right. we simultaneously play both a reproductive role and a transformative role. We may bring about more transformation in the area of race and less transformation in the area of gender and patriarchy, simultaneously, right? We're doing the one. I mean, look at the Rhodes Must Fall movement, if you like. Look at the patriarchy there. Look at the fights around those issues. Right? It's happening simultaneously. So you and I should have a different discussion around the implant and so on. The reality in this country is that the first teachers and all those people who came to this university didn't come under apartheid. They came in the 1820s. The first universities was created, the genesis of the first university was created not far here in 1850s. They were mainly teachers from Scotland and graduates of Cambridge and Oxford and so on. So what we have is not a product of apartheid. We have a product of colonialism from the 19th century. And the Nkrumahs and whoever has been at all those other institutions, those are individuals fighting heroic battles and things like that. I'm talking about the implantation of an institution system and culture, and an academic culture. Not about simply ideas. It's institutions were set up here, modeled on. Rhodes University for a long time was called Oxford in the Veld. Professor of history will tell you that. Paul Mailer was a great historian. Oxford in the Veld. The rationale for the creation of Rhodes University was to counter this folk here in Stellenbosch. That's why they got money from Rhodes Estate, to create Rhodes as a counter to this. These people in Victoria College were getting up to nonsense, according to them. That's why the money came to Rhodes University. And read when they're setting up Rhodes what they're talking about, how that university was going to enculture people into the imperial and colonial mindset and so on, and win them to the cause of Great Britain. And then it became, we are the Princeton of South Africa, Rhodes University. I'm happy to say after 3 months at Rhodes, when I became Vice Chancellor, no one was speaking about Princeton anymore. Because I would say to them, what's wrong with you? You have an identity crisis. You want to be Oxford, you want to be Princeton. Why don't we just be what we are? A university in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, rather than this ideals of being Princeton and Oxford. And when we get $20 billion reserve funds like Princeton, maybe we can be like Princeton then. Right? You see the picture that holds us captive around these kinds of things. These are very powerful narratives that many people have bought into about. So it's implanted into this country. And so we play a reproductive role and we play a transformative role and so on. So I don't want to speak about STIAS. That's a separate issue. I'm a fellow at STIAS. I don't know the insides and outsides of how STIAS works. I'm not sure myself, when I look at it objectively, that STIAS is a place for critical thought. It's a place for outstanding scholars to come. And I have no doubts that there could be many other outstanding scholars there. But precisely what their criteria and so on, I can't tell you. I'm not part of their management and so on. I'm like a fellow like everyone else. And so who has applied and whether they've got a letter and so on, I like to work on facts in terms of those kinds of things. So I think that's best taken up with STIAS itself. But I would be horrified if people are being rejected because they're women, because they're black, or they don't get letters and things like that. I mean, that I can't comment on.
Should we take one more round? So this is the final round. We have Simon Becker. Okay, we're coming. Okay, so this time
sure.
We're going to do more than 3 or so.
Yeah.
2, but
Yes, Professor Bauer, thank you very much. My name is Simon Becker. I'm a retired emeritus sociologist from Stellenbosch. And
could you put your mic on?
my mic is on. Can you not hear me?
Okay, not for a question.
I have no idea.
Okay.
It's on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have an online question.
Yeah.
Okay, in the meantime, while we get that sorted out, Z, you have a question.
Okay, sorry, just the one important thing. Look, it's not about being closed to decolonial thought. Don't misread me. I'm saying that you can only come to other theories on the basis of what you already are. So I'm declaring it openly. I come from a Marxist theory background. I'm trying to look at decolonial theory in its own rights, in terms of where it comes from and so on. And I'm quite happy to bring into my own theoretical framework what I think is positive. And what my concerns would be, I have to then register that, right? That doesn't mean that everything about Marxist, that's why you won't hear me talking about socialism today, because I don't know what it means.
Okay, can you hear me?
We have to rethink a whole lot of things of Marxist theory, and political theory, and so on, right? So right now, I'm more open to being, if you like, eclectic. What is the question? And bringing together all kinds of thoughts and ideas that make sense in terms of approaching the question, right? Whether the question is political or the question is academic. But you're right. I mean, in that sense, Marxism is part of the problem.
Okay, on the computer.
Okay.
Thank you so much for such a sobering talk. I really enjoy listening your stuff and also Professor Jansen's stuff. So
Yeah.
I got into these issues probably in 2019.
Is it the iPad thing?
By Professor Jansen called Best by 5.
Yeah.
So I wanted to help us with this. What is also called career student.
You see.
Where someone becomes strategies to competent creatively.
Okay, can you hear us in the room now?
So in that book, it is said that only 50% of students will get into the system. Right. Then the rest will follow. And is this the responsibility of universities? Well, the answer says no. It's probably the whole idea that
So I think on the iPad.
Universities to accept a certain number of students. So I wanted to comment on that, just in terms of the relationship between the state and the university.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. So, and then the other thing is, I was at Rose for a very long time. I went there in 2013.
So, okay. So now you said
the Rose University that I left in 2018 was totally different.
Okay.
In terms of transformation. I remember at some point, Cecil once said that Rose University is highly untransformed. Then it made me think about issues to do with meanings of transformation. What do we mean?
Okay, can you hear us now?
At what point are we going?
For those online,
The hell does it mean? I'm serious. I mean, the person who spoke about this, I should have attributed
Simon,
it to Manuel
apparently they
Castells.
can't hear us. You just need to write in the
He's
chat.
the one who's observed.
If you still
South Africans drink a lot of wine. The word transformation keeps coming out of their mouths, and it becomes vacuous in a sense, right? So, what do we mean by transformation, right? Beyond just talk about transformation. And for me, that you actually have to talk about what does transformation mean in terms of the governance of the university? What does it mean in terms of finance of the university? What does it mean in terms of curriculum? What does it mean in terms of, research? A whole, what the university is all about, if you like, right? Rather than what it has become reduced to entirely. How many black students do you have? And how many black academics do you have? That's an important part of transformation. Don't get me wrong. But if that's the sum total of transformation, then we're in deep trouble. And I think too many people in government, and perhaps the courtois also, have that notion. And by the way, I learned during my 8 years at Rhodes, the people who make comments about what is transformed and what is transformed are not bothered by looking at data. It's all in their heads, right? So I go to a meeting with the Eastern Cape Premier, and someone there says, Rhodes is full of foreigners. full of, and it says foreigners, you know, that kind of xenophobic kind of thing. And I say, sorry, what do you mean it's full of foreigners? Oh, we all know that there are more foreign students at Rhodes than South African students. Really? I haven't come across the data myself. Because Rhodes was the most international university at that point at 25% when I started in 2006, right? And we set a deliberate target of bringing it down to 20%, right? In order to make place for more Black South African students. You make those choices, okay? But it's certainly not full of foreigners. And by the time I left Rhodes in 2014, Black student numbers were close to 65, 67%, because we put every spare rand we could into. Right? So that's the first point. Politicians can't be bothered about the facts. When I started at Rhodes in 2006, right, the Black staff were 12%. When I left, and I sleep comfortably with this, it was about 26%. You know, let's be honest, every percent is a struggle at the staff levels. And not only because people want to come and work at Rhodes, but there's something called Makanda, which is not the best place for many Black people to come and work. Right? It's a small town. You either have to like a small town or not, and so on. So the struggle to retain people when they've spent 2 years in Makanda, and there's things about finding partners and things like that in Makanda too. That's a real issue. And if you're gay, that's another issue, and so on. Right? So to de-racialize the staff was a hell of a problem at Rhodes, right? And I wouldn't be surprised, but certainly Rhodes was far better than here, right? Because this institution was the one in numerical and demographic terms, the one that's lagging behind the most, right? So I think we have to really define what we transformation in all its kind of arenas, and then be able to measure on some objective basis, right? In a quantitative sense, but also in a qualitative sense, right? The second part was what? Sorry. Yeah, look, you know, Jonathan and I engage very vigorously and robustly. I would put things a bit differently from the way he put things sometimes, right? So, could we be doing better than 50%? Well, here's the statistics for you. In the United States, with all its wealth, what percentage graduate? 50%. Only 50% graduate in the United States too. All our graduation rates at master's, doctoral rates are not very different from other countries, actually. So some part of the responsibility of the poor graduation rates, I think, has to be laid squarely at the feet of schools who have underprepared students, right? Another part must be laid at the door of the universities, which are underprepared themselves in order to work with different students and so on. So it's quite a complex issue. And even if we do everything right, we may not have 90% graduation rates. We may get 55%. Oh, by the way, the 50% is an average, remember. The graduation rates at Stellenbosch, Rhodes, Wits, UCT are much higher than other universities. So remember, that's an average. The University of Technology graduation rates are much lower than universities. Remember, it's an average.
Thank you very much. I mean, we have covered an enormous amount, and these conversations will continue. We're hoping to have a conference at the end of the year as part of the Index in Transformation. Sorry to use the word.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll have more clarity about what this animal is.
That transformation. Yeah. By then we'll have sorted out. And we've invited Professor to talk on well, you'll decide exactly topic, but related to these kinds of issues. And I think there couldn't be a more relevant topic for us. So thank you all for staying for this. I think we normally stop at 2:30, but I think it's been really interesting. And thanks to all the online people as well. And the conversations will continue. So thank you very much. Sure.
Thank you.